Hello, and welcome to this very special presentation on what the academic EM doc should know about sexual harassment. My name is Kat Ogle, and I am an emergency physician in Washington, D.C. The content we are presenting to you today has been carefully curated and developed by a diverse team of your peers. We present this information to you with the best intent and an evidence-informed lens. However, we recognize that there are nuances and caveats which are out of the scope of this presentation. Given the complexity of this topic, both from a regulatory and a legal standpoint, please allow this to serve as a primer for an individual exploration and reflection on creating safe spaces for our learners, staff, and colleagues. Our team is Dr. Michael Cole, Dr. Namita Jaiprakash, Dr. James Miner, myself, and Dr. Laura Walker. Dr. Cole?
Thank you for joining us. Why are we all here today? We're here because of a deep concern out of an issue that regrettably is all too common. And the FAM board of directors and the faculty development committee, they recruited us and we volunteered for this to really address an important gap in the resources that SAM has to offer their members. So we collectively, in collaboration with the board of directors, developed a position statement on sexual harassment and misconduct. And if you scan the QR code, you can go right to that position statement. And this is kind of a part of it is a three-part approach to starting to fill this known gap. And this webinar is the position statement is the first step. This webinar is the second step, and it's going to lead into an interactive didactic for SAM 22, which we hope that all of you on the call can actually join us at. It's going to be May 12th at 4 o'clock. And some of the content and the discussion that comes up in this webinar will be transitioned over to the didactic. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael. So our intention today is to go through a couple of things. We want to define sexual harassment so that we're all grounding on the same words and actions. We're going to dive into the scope of the problem and how many individuals it impacts. We're going to talk about reporting in various different scenarios and what gets in the way of reporting. Now, while we don't have time today to really dive into specific and very detailed scenarios, we're going to broadly touch on situations in which a victim is a learner, a peer, or a supervisor.
So I will be kicking us off talking about really the definitions of sexual harassment, and it's very broad and includes not just kind of those verbal interactions, nonverbal interactions that we have, but also sexual violence and gender-based harassment. And we use sexual harassment as well as sexual misconduct as these larger umbrellas term, and so that's what you'll see in the SAM statement as well as throughout this presentation here. One thing that underlies really all of the definition of this is that the victim's perspective is paramount in defining what sexual harassment is. If the person who is on the receiving end of either comments or actions feels that those are unwelcome and it's of a sexual nature, then that is in this umbrella and it is sexual harassment. The other important thing to consider here is how power differentials come into play. You can kind of think about differences in giving consent to different relationships that we have and different ways we interact with people. And there is a clear difference between making or receiving an unsolicited sexual comment to someone versus having some open communication and establishing consensual boundaries to a relationship. And when there's a power differential at play, that makes that consent to have a different type of relationship very complicated. We all work with learners. There are different hierarchies within our workplaces. And there may be situations where one person perceives a power differential and one may not have considered that. And so it's really important to just, as you are interacting with people, understand that the victim's perspective is paramount, and power differentials complicate the ability to give consent to a relationship that has kind of these components to it. So again, sexual harassment very broadly is an unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, includes unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal, nonverbal, or physical conduct of a sexual nature. Suggestive statements, as I mentioned before, dirty jokes, locker room talk, all of those things can fall under this umbrella. And it's the perspective of the recipient of that discussion or those actions that defines whether or not it's harassment. And in addition to kind of the broad items there, consider electronic communications as well. Texting with people, DMs, sending unwanted images, all of those are encompassed as sexual harassment. Sexual violence is a form of sexual harassment. And this one, I think, is among the easier things for us to identify broadly when we go as far as rape and sexual abuse, sexual assault, unwanted touch. Those are all forms of sexual violence. And it's a non-legal term, which we'll encounter a lot throughout this as one of the nuances we mentioned before, but it is inclusive of all those things. And finally, I think, we've all fortunately had a lot more increased awareness of the importance of supporting diverse gender identities. And I would say, at least personally, haven't seen as much discussion on where disrespectful behavior towards individuals with regard to their gender identity and expression has been explicitly identified as sexual harassment. And it is absolutely included under this umbrella. So you can see here, sexual harassment includes gender-based harassment, which is unwelcome conduct based on an individual's sex, harassing conduct based on a student or an individual's failure to conform to sex stereotypes. And so as we consider different gender identities, different expressions of gender, transgender individuals, those who are non-binary or genderqueer, and also cisgender stereotypes, any comments or behaviors that are negative, biased, harassing of that identity or that person based on where they are in the gender spectrum is also included as part of the definition of sexual harassment. And again, remember that harassment is determined by the perspective of the victim and not by the intrinsic beliefs of the accused.
Discrimination and harassment by gender are prevalent in industries where women make up the majority of the workforce, but hold a minority of the positions of power. Next slide. Sexual harassment exploded into the consciousness of the American people with the Senate confirmation hearing of now Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. In October 1991, the televised testimony of law professor Anita Hill in front of an all-male Senate Judiciary Committee was uncomfortable and described some as cringeworthy. It was the first time that someone had spoken so openly about workplace discrimination. Hill described a pattern of harassment by Justice Clarence Thomas while in positions of power.
I did see,
Hill's testimony started to spark conversations where women began to realize that their individual experiences were in fact shared experiences. Claims of sexual harassment increased, and eventually Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which gave victims of workplace sexual harassment more legal recourse. Next slide. Female medical trainees report vastly higher rates of sexual harassment than trainees in the sciences and engineering. 50 to 60% of medical students have experienced harassment before their careers have even begun. Emergency medicine as a specialty is not immune. Reports in the literature suggest up to 53% of women in emergency medicine have experienced unwanted sexual behavior. Next slide. In considering sexual harassment, you heard that the victim's perspective remains paramount. Ways to categorize the types of harassment victims are subjected to include patient-initiated, peer-initiated, and supervisor-initiated. Next slide. Workplace discrimination, regardless of the source, is associated with adverse physical and mental health, including increased rates of anxiety, depression, and cardiovascular diseases. Patient-initiated sexual harassment is an area of limited research and reporting, which makes it difficult to understand the true prevalence. The physician is tasked with caring for the health of the patient, and there's no clear guidance on how to respond to patient-initiated sexual harassment and abuse. Often, it is perceived as a hazard of the job, for which physician resilience should handle it. This carries in itself an increased hazard of worsening the impact on physician health and safety. Next slide. Sexual harassment impacts our residents. In a 2020 survey administered at the end of the IT examination, 14.7% of respondents self-reported experiencing sexual harassment from the beginning of 2019 to taking the IT exam. The main source of this sexual harassment included patients and their families, followed by nurses and other staff. 29% of residents reported verbal or emotional abuse. The most common source, patients and patients' family members, followed by attending physicians. Next slide. Among faculty, a 2019 cross-sectional survey across 6 urban academic centers identified that discriminatory treatment was most commonly experienced by women, but both genders were equally likely to have observed it. 52.9% of women faculty reported that unwanted sexual comments, attention, or advancement from a work superior or colleague had occurred in their professional careers. The 3 most common sources of discriminatory treatment were, again, patients, consulting or admitting staff, and nurses. The majority of these were sexist remarks or unwanted sexual advances. The majority of the respondents stated that it had little to no significant impact on their self-confidence or career advancement. This finding was different from other studies, such as Jackson et al., who surveyed KOA and K23 Career Development Award recipients. Amongst these academicians, 30% of women had experienced sexual harassment compared to only 4% of men. And amongst the women, 59% perceived a negative impact on their confidence, and 47% perceived a negative impact on their career advancement.
So what do we do when it comes to reporting? So in 1972, there was legislation that was put into place that prohibited any kind of sexual harassment or sexual violence in educational scenarios. This holds hospitals and universities that are responsible for training medical students and residents accountable if they become aware of any sort of sexual harassment or misconduct. As academic emergency medicine physicians and individuals who are often supervising and supporting trainees, it is also incumbent upon us to be a part of the solution when it comes to identifying misconduct or harassment. It's up to us to support a zero tolerance policy. Now, when we think about who the mandatory reporters are, and I'm going to use that term, which is not universal, and this is because Title IX policies are actually written for each individual educational institution. So the term that is used to describe the individuals who are required to report incidents of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct or sexual violence, those individuals may have different names in different institutions. And it's important for you as an academic emergency medicine physician to be aware of what the language is that's being used in your organization. You should be able to find this information on your organization's Title IX website, and you should have a Title IX office that you can seek out direction and guidance from. sure where that went. There we go. Okay, so what do we do when it happens to a student? It is up to us to reach out to the Title IX office and speak to the Title IX investigators. What the Title IX investigators do at that point in time is they will reach out to the victim or the individual who was harassed. There are a lot of steps in the process which are designed to protect the learner from any sort of harassment after the fact, any bullying after the fact, or any sort of negative consequences. And it's also up to the individual educational institutions to provide support to the victims of sexual harassment in the form of counseling and also in the form of autonomy. Individuals who have been a victim of sexual harassment in an educational institution are not required to pursue an investigation. However, these things should still be reported so that they can be tracked and so that each individual instance can be further investigated. Now, individuals may choose not to seek a formal investigation, including themselves, which means that they will not be speaking directly to the investigators. They will not be providing additional evidence or data. However, again, according to Title IX, because the funding that's provided for these educational institutions is coming from federal sources, you are required to track this information. Now, there are some educational institutions which have other reporting systems which provide a different avenue by which to report things. And this could be an anonymous reporting system, which may be online, or there may be an individual ombudsman who they can seek out. If you have any curiosity and you want to know more about the legislation, this Title IX fact sheet actually provides a reasonable amount of information and clarity on the actual legislation. So you're welcome to take a look at that. And we'll be providing you some additional resources at the end of the webinar. So what do we do when it's actually impacting us in the workplace and our peers? This gets a little bit more complicated because, again, while there is federal law supporting a workplace that is free of discrimination and free of harassment, particularly under the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, each organization and their structures and their policies for responding to these instances varies from place to place. And so it's going to be important for you to go back to your organization and figure out exactly what the process is. Now, many places do use a grievance type policy or process where an incident occurs, it is reported through the chain of command, and then it goes to the HR office. There are other institutions which actually have an ombudsman type situation, which provides a different layer of support. But it's important to know exactly what exists in your organization. Again, you may also have an anonymous reporting opportunity, but ultimately, the key here is that there needs to be mechanisms in place that provide the opportunity for reporting without fear of retaliation. And there needs to be clear training on the existing structures in each organization. There also should be a very clearly stated zero tolerance policy. As Dr. Walker mentioned, locker room talk should be a minimum. And us as professional societies have a responsibility to not only teach our peers and teach our communities, but to also uphold the same policies in support of all individuals that are in academic emergency medicine. The last part is we need to have funded research that actually looks into this problem and figures out exactly what happens when there are interventions on a harasser. Because many times there are processes behind the HR sort of black box, if you will, which we are not necessarily privy to, because while the victims have a right to privacy and a right to non-harassment, the individuals who are accused also have a right to privacy and to non-harassment. So what do we do in scenarios in which there's a patient involved? And again, Dr. Walker mentioned briefly, and Dr. Jayaprakash also mentioned, there are not very clear guidelines on what to do when a patient is a harasser. It's very complicated because we are beholden to EMTALA in order to make sure that the patients are taken care of. And we sometimes feel, again, it's just a hazard of the job that we have to sort of just take these things as they come. There are opportunities to engage your hospital security. You'll want to take a look at your hospital policies to see what the response is, what you're allowed to do in response to this. Make sure to set clear boundaries for your patients and your staff and your learners as well. And there was an article that we reviewed that had this sort of algorithm that helps you to figure out exactly what to do with your next steps. So the first question is, do you feel safe? While we are trying to ensure the patient safety, we also have to make sure that we are safe ourselves. So if you are not safe, then you need to find a way to get out of the room and find some help. You want to file a report appropriately in your institution. And then if possible, you may need to transfer the care of that patient to another individual. Now, if you are safe, you have an opportunity to address it directly with the patient, to state very clear and firm boundaries about the type of behavior that you will accept and the type of behavior that you will not accept. Either the patient responds affirmatively and changes the way they behave, but if they continue to pursue inappropriate behavior, then you move over to the other side of the algorithm.
So I'm going to speak about the barriers that are experienced by victims of sexual harassment, and these barriers are both diverse and specific. What's meant by that? They're diverse amongst the victims that experience sexual harassment, meaning they're going to across the spectrum. There's going to be a very diverse set of barriers that are experienced, but also specific to each circumstance, as well as each individual, and also the culture of the institution where one works. So that's what we mean by diverse, specific, personal, institutional, right? So these are kind of different barriers that one faces, and we're going to talk about some of these barriers now. And why is it important to be aware of these? Because someone may come to you with a report of a sexual harassment incident, or you may witness the incident, or you may be the victim yourself. And it's important to be aware of these barriers that are often present that prevent the reporting of these events, and in order to best kind of hold those responsible for such harassment and for getting the victims the assistance that would best support them. So we feel it's pretty important to be aware of these barriers. So the literature divides these up into personal barriers, institutional barriers, and then also barriers that are more common across genders and barriers that are a little more gender specific. So regarding just kind of across all genders, what's been reported most commonly are things like shame of reporting and the guilt surrounding not only the reporting of these events, but also this idea that the victim doesn't want to be responsible for dooming this professor's career so there's guilt. There's lots of different forms of guilt that come associated with this. Negative social reactions, which are I'm sorry, can you go back one slide? Thanks. Negative social reactions that are things like embarrassment, not wanting friends and family to know. And this is more important now than ever in the era of social media, which leads us to the next thing as well, these concerns about confidentiality, which when you do interact with, when you do speak with victims, it's best to really assure them about the confidentiality of the conversation. Fear of not being believed, and then barriers to accessing support services, which hopefully is not something that people in our institutions will experience. That being said, it's a very real issue for those that are outside of a kind of a institutional workforce. So you go to the next slide, please. So the more gender specific barriers, are listed here, you know, in individuals who identify as women, fear retaliation, and for men, it's more traditional gender roles and norms, and impacts, you know, of their identity, impacts on their identity, on their self. And there's not a lot of literature, unfortunately, on transgender, non-binary barriers, unfortunately. So that's why I kind of just listed those here, kind of for future research and future inquiry. So, next slide, please. And then when we talk about the institutional barriers, a lot of these, you know, we may have alluded to before, and I'm sure you're probably aware of a lot of these, not only in the domain of sexual harassment, but in other domains as well. Unclear policies and reporting structures, poor adherence to procedures, and follow through when a case does. We alluded to this earlier. When a case does get reported, where's the follow through on that, and how are we reassured by that in any way? Not a lot of support for victims, regrettably, or protection for victims, which again, that gets back to the kind of personal barriers. Which is important. And this punitive environment for whistleblowers, and then this idea that perpetrators just get off. They always get off, or this terrible concept that they're just like that. They're just like that always. They're gonna always be like that, and kind of an acceptance or a normalizing of behavior that should not be accepted or normalized anyway. And then also this, gets back to unclear policies, but it's this idea of the absence of standardized approaches to ensure accountability. So these are all the institutional barriers. During our review of literature, we came upon this really nice kind of we call inclusive language. This idea that it's really a great expression that should really give us all direction as you move forward in our journey to try to address this real true injustice. So I'll read it, I guess, for those of you that can't see the screen. Physicians need to take this process built upon safety and encourage those in medicine to be brave and to speak out when they are or witness someone else who is being harassed or disrespected. Every physician, regardless of gender identity or gender expression, should feel empowered and encouraged to speak up without fear if they ever experience or observe behavior that betrays the values central to a person's identity. Every physician should be brave enough to say, this behavior makes me feel uncomfortable, or I feel disrespected to anyone who is inappropriate or disrespectful. And so hopefully that's can serve as a charge to us all as we move forward.
So one of the challenges when we're dealing with a topic that is an emotional topic, and it's a challenging topic because it's a challenging problem to solve, is what in the world do we do with this? And when we reviewed the literature, we found a couple of different approaches. One of them is to look at the institutional level and ensure that at an institutional level, you have clear policies that are easy to find, that state what a harassment-free workplace looks like. And what that means is you need to have a space in which there is not fear of retaliation or retribution if someone reports something. You also need to have those clear procedures for addressing when a policy is broken, when harassment occurs. What are the steps? They should be very clear and very transparent. You have to have regular education and training on harassment. And the reason that we are having a didactic on this in May is because we want to go through specific different scenarios and examples to provide people with opportunities to practice what to do should they come upon a situation like this. Your safe reporting system really needs to make sure that there is no opportunity for retaliation for any victims that are bringing concerns to the forefront. that protection really needs to cover their clinical work, their academic work, their opportunities for advancement, and it also needs to protect them personally. If they are harassed by an individual, there should be opportunities and there should be systems within your institution to separate those individuals while an investigation is pending. And a lot of these things are going to fall under the purview of HR. And one of the challenges there is we may not necessarily be privy to every step that's taken, but we do need to be very clear and very intentional about what we can do to support victims in this scenario. Further, we should spend some of our departmental and institutional resources on providing counseling and support services to the victims. We've already discussed very briefly how this has a long-term potential impact because this is a form of trauma. And we're going to dive into trauma-informed care and a trauma-informed approach to this in May as well, because that's a whole other part of this topic that we've not even unroofed yet. Now, when you're looking at it from a departmental level, you need to be very careful and very mindful of those individuals who may be vulnerable and may not necessarily feel comfortable discussing concerns that they have. And that goes back to what Dr. Walker was saying about the power differential, or at least a perceived power differential. And just depending on where someone grew up, how they interacted with people, what their gender norms were sort of expected, there may be perceived power differentials which hinder an individual's autonomy or drive to come to the forefront when they are being harassed. It's also really essential that all of your staff are familiar with not only the policies at your organization, but also any laws that may be impacted and further institutional policies that cross not only just the department level, but the institutional level. The investigations have to be taken seriously. They have to be thorough and most likely are going to involve some sort of legal counsel. It is also absolutely essential that individuals who are accused are removed from clinical care in parallel with the individual who has accused them. There should be a safe space in which they do not have to interact, and that's for the protection of both individuals. And that's just kind of restating the same thing. There shouldn't be forced opportunities for them to work in the same clinical space because that's going to heighten the stress and potential tension, and also probably has an impact on patient care. Now, for an individual level, this is probably where we have the most potential impact. It is our responsibility to handle ourselves and our professional comportment in an ethical and appropriate manner. So bringing your best face forward and making sure that you're actually performing and communicating in the most professional way is the biggest protection that you can provide for yourself. If you see inappropriate and unprofessional behavior, you have to say something. You have to reach out to those individuals. And if it's someone that you have an established relationship with, perhaps you don't want to say something in front of everybody else. We think about when we give feedback to learners, if you have something that's challenging that you have to tell a learner, you have some constructive criticism to give them, you don't do so in front of everyone. You take them aside and you tell them that you have a concern. So you say, I'm concerned that I saw something back there and I don't think that that was appropriate and it made me feel some kind of a way. And it may be simply that that individual was not aware of their impact of their behavior. The last part of it is do whatever you can to promote emotional and psychological safety. When individuals come to you with a concern, please be mindful that that is their lived experience. You did not live through their shoes. You were not there in the incident most of the time, and you don't know what it felt like to be them. And because sexual harassment is really in the eye of the beholder, it's important to affirm the experience of the individuals. So if we could take this and put it in 3 steps of what to do. The first step is making sure that you are educated. And so again, this is the beginning of a conversation. This is not an all-encompassing presentation that covers everything you ever needed to know about sexual harassment. We're really just scratching the surface, and we're hoping to begin a conversation so that this can become a more organic conversation that we can have without so much tension and difficulty. Take the information that you have in your individual institution so that you're clear about what steps need to be taken if you happen upon an incident or if you are a victim of harassment. And then the next step is knowing what those action steps are. What are those next steps? What are you supposed to do? So I challenge each and every one of you to think about, what is it that you would do if a trainee reached out to you in confidence to describe an incident of sexual harassment? Go back to your organization, take a look at your Title IX policies and figure out what the process is so that you can counsel the trainee on what their options are. You can counsel the trainee on what they can expect from the Title IX protections, and you can support them and affirm them and acknowledge their experience. If it's a colleague, again, make sure that you're familiar with your own departmental and institutional policies so that you know what the next steps are. In that moment, you provide support to your peer, you provide support to your colleague, but then also having some clarity about what to do next will empower them and also empower you. Excuse me. The last part is, what if it's you? What if you are the individual who is being harassed? Who are your safe people? Who do you trust to talk to? And what can you do in your organization to make it a safer space for yourself and for everyone else? With that, we'll pause for any questions that may be coming in from the live feed or from the Zoom chat. And if you don't have any questions, we have some prepared. Sometimes people need to just take a moment to process before they can ask questions. So
While
maybe
we're, I was saying, while we're thinking, I'll start with an easy question, maybe not an easy question, an important question. One of the things we see is that often when there's sexual harassment and a person has experienced multiple episodes of harassment, their colleagues haven't done anything to support them, whether it's a trainee or a colleague. And when we go back later and try to figure out what happened and ask the colleagues, they say, well, I didn't know it didn't appear criminal. It didn't appear something like, I wasn't really sure what the line was and what my role is. And then a lot of times the victim sees that other colleagues saw this and didn't say anything and thinks to themselves, am I overacting? Maybe no one else said anything. Maybe this is okay. And it sets up a pattern of tolerance that we don't, that obviously exists in medicine we don't need. What can we look for? And not the obvious stuff where it's clearly inappropriate. What sort of things do we look for to find those abuses that definitely need to be interrupted and recognized, but are easier to explain away?
That is a very simple and also very complex question. Thanks, Jim. Anyone want to take it?
I think there are kind of two parts to what you said. It's the colleagues witness that it didn't do anything and their perception is it's not criminal and therefore, I'm not responsible to do anything. And I think that's a common misperception in all of this. And really, when you get into the Title IX requirements and individual institutional requirements, it's not a criminal bar to determine whether or not something gets reported. The bar is that an episode of harassment occurred, which again is in the victim's perception. And so, it reflects on the culture, kind of what things are tolerated and what things are not, but not everybody is going to ascribe to the same set of beliefs and have the same, understanding of what is appropriate and not appropriate. And so I think it's unfortunate, but probably common that situations like that occur. So that's the first part there.
And what about the second part?
I'm going to need that question restated again.
Well, I think you kind of ended up addressing both parts, because the part really is, how do we recognize it, and is it okay to not recognize it? And I think it'd be really good. You bring up really good points. It's a matter of perspective, especially as you get into the non-criminal aspects of it. If a person feels harassed, they're harassed, and if you see behavior where it appears that someone is being harassed, and you look like that, and you think it's unwelcome behavior, it is by definition, because there's two real definitions that I've seen used. One is that the person doesn't welcome behavior and didn't see it as fostering a trusting work environment. And the other is that an external layperson would look at it and say clearly that was unwelcome behavior. And either of those things meet the definition of inappropriate workplace behavior that needs to be eliminated.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and just adding on to that, and with the comment in the chat kind of to the same effect, is that third party who's witnessing this behavior that maybe doesn't appear unwelcome to the direct recipient, are they then like a second victim sort of harassment if it's something they're uncomfortable witnessing? And that needs to be taken into account as well. Like this can balloon pretty far depending on what the actual situation is.
Yeah, I think the idea of a second victim syndrome is interesting. I took this question from Dr. Dine a little bit differently, and I took it to think, if it's not bothering the person to whom I thought it was inappropriate, then it must not be harassment, or I don't have a responsibility to report it or address it. And I think, there's a couple of different ways to do that. And I think as emergency physicians, we are really good about maintaining a poker face, right? It doesn't matter what's going on. It doesn't matter what's hitting the fan. We are very good at maintaining a calm appearing demeanor. We have no idea what's going on under the water. So are the feet kicking? Is the duck just kicking away? And so I think that there are a couple of different things we can do in that situation. If it's a trainee, I probably would take the trainee aside and I would say, I noticed this happen, or I saw this happen, and I'm curious to know whether you experienced it the way I saw it and how you feel about it. Because that may help to uncover how the person is feeling about it. I think the second part of this is, it's also okay to take your colleague aside and say, I saw this happen. I saw this interaction. And I have to be honest with you, if I had been on the receiving end of that situation, I would have been uncomfortable. Yeah, Dr. Hayes, that's a really great question. And I have to sort of go back and say, it's going to depend on what the policy is. It's going to depend on what the policy is in the organization. And what the investigation process is, and how many HRs are involved. So many of us work in institutions where there are multiple different leadership structures and multiple different organizations. So that crosstalk can be very difficult to manage. Dr. Walker, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Nothing beyond what you said. If we're both working physically in the same environment, there's going to be some agreements on kind of how these disputes are resolved. And as you said, kind of individual to the organization where you are, they're going to need to be able to navigate that.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to put one out there. What if someone discloses an experience to you? What do you do in that moment?
I can tackle that. I think the first thing to really be cognizant of that is the importance of acknowledging that experience. So the victim's perspective is really, go back to that word, it's paramount, like that person is in the moment, they had a perception, is to validate it, acknowledge it. And that opens in a conversation that will hopefully be built in a little bit more trust and consideration of what next steps should be beyond that experience, but I think it's most important to acknowledge the experience from from the victim's perspective.
I think you bring up a really good point. I think it's not a good time for the detailed analysis of of what the person did, or trying to figure out what the motivation of the harasser should have been. I think it's just a time to say, I'm sorry that happened to you. This is really bad. I'm really glad you brought me this information because we can do something about this. What can I do for you? And worry about the details later. Because I've seen that not go well when someone tries to report harassment and they feel like the first thing they're asked is, well, did you just realize they're having a bad day? Or maybe you took it out of context. It's never going to be well received, and it's not going to be helpful at all to that person.
What if someone reaches out to you in confidence, and it's let's say that it's a peer, it's not a trainee. They reach out to you in confidence and they tell you about a situation of harassment, which if it happened to you, you would want to pursue some sort of a report and investigation. But the individual speaking to you is simply seeking your counsel and your support, and they do not wish to pursue it. What do you do then?
I can give a very good example on that one, because as a department chair, a lot of people bring information to me about the physicians in my department. And it's very rare that somebody messes up once. In fact, it just doesn't happen, right? So almost always when someone comes to me with, I just want to tell you what happened, and I don't want you to identify me, and I don't want anyone to know about this, it's still incredibly useful to me, because there's usually 10 other things that I can find, and this person has got a pattern of a behavior, and this will clue me in to find it or to look more closely for it. And I'd say that's happened a couple of times for someone's come to me and said, I just don't feel comfortable having anyone know I'm telling you this. Which is why I know the most important thing I can do is say, I'm really glad you told me this, and what can I do for you, and how important this is. Because if somebody's got a pattern of abusive behavior, it doesn't take very long to find more. You just have to start looking. And the person doesn't, I mean, it's helpful if they want to report formally and move through it, but it's not paramount to avoiding the situation, protecting them from future problems, and stopping the person with the harassing behavior from continuing.
And reassuring them of that confidentiality is essential, right? And abiding by that as well. Is that true, Jim? Yeah.
So that's a nice segue to another question. And this falls over into potential barriers to reporting and whether or not we're actually capturing how often this happens because of underreporting. But some people choose not to report because they feel like nothing's going to happen. They feel like there will be no consequences. They feel like no one's ever believed and there are no consequences to this happening, and folks are just going to continue doing what they're doing. And so what would you say to an individual who is leaning back on not wanting to report or being frustrated perhaps with the perceived response of a report?
So this one, as you mentioned before, for me, if I am in a situation where someone has divulged to me and is planning on reporting or is expressing, as you said, some frustration with this, it comes back to that black box of HR. And, you go through the process of reporting. There is or is not an investigation, kind of depending on how everyone decides they want to take it. But I would say in helping kind of shepherd people through situations like this, it is not gratifying oftentimes, because you do not see an outcome unless there's a very obvious, someone is dismissed from work or something like that. But any, kind of written warnings or warnings that an individual receives as kind of the consequence of their behavior, we will never know. The victim will never know. Any support person will never know. The only people that will know will be the accused and the individuals in HR. And I can absolutely see people being very discouraged when they know something's been reported, either by themselves or by someone else, and they see nothing has happened. And I think that is a potential barrier to people reporting. when they feel like there is no consequence and they're putting themselves out on the line. But the fact is, when a situation goes down that pathway, it's that black box.
And there's a lot of reasons for that. That we worry about reprisal against a victim, and a lot of victims don't want to be, you're that person that ruined so and so's career by complaining about them. And they shouldn't have to be, because those people ruin their own career, right? They just and so it's very important when somebody complains that they don't have that problem of now being labeled as somebody who went after someone else, because they haven't done anything except be a victim, so they shouldn't have to suffer consequences for reporting it.
So for those of you who are watching, this QR code will take you to our top articles from our review that we found particularly informative and helpful. You will also find at this document on the bottom, there's an email. So if you have any additional resources, or if you have any suggestions about how we can improve this type of thing in the future, or things that we can take into our didactic with everyone in May, or future content that might be relevant to this or important to this, or another hole in the resources that we have available to you as the SAM community, please do reach out. We thank you very much for your attendance and for your time. And